record.
أوف أوف يابا الله يا ميجانا ويا ميجانا ويا ميجانا غرد يا بلبل عزتون بلادنا وغرد يا بلبل عزتون بلادنا جبل القفز نادى عجبل زيتون ايوه خلوا نار حب الوطن زيتون نحنا بالأرض نحنا بالأرض أغصان زيتون نحني بس لنبوس الترايب يا رايب الأرض إلنا والبلاد بلادنا والأرض إلنا والبلاد بلادنا على دلعونا وعلى دلعونا زيتون بلاد.
So as beautiful as that song is, and I would love to keep playing it, just for time's sake, we'll pause there. So, very quick, can someone you can just unmute and share, what's happening in this scene here?
The women are singing about olive trees. And I'm assuming they're collecting olives.
Thanks, Mana. Good. So they are singing about olive trees and the land. Any other comments about where the setting is? You can guess it. Or when, I guess my question should be. So this is actually during the olive harvest season. So the olive harvest season is a very special time for Palestinians. Sorry, you know what? Yeah. Sorry guys, this is always never my strong suit. Okay. So that is during the olive harvest season. So it's a special time for Palestinians. I just want to go back to full screen. So it's a special time for Palestinians because it's a season where it's a communal gathering. It's actually very important for the Palestinian economy. So much of what Palestinians make during the year is from the olive harvest season. They depend on it not just for the olive oil, but to make other products and then to sell it and to sustain an income. It also is very significant because it represents ties to the land and connection to the land and sustenance and a lot more. Even the olive tree itself is very significant because it dates back to thousands of years old. So many people will say the olive trees are older than the state of Israel. So this is something very important to Palestine as a symbol and as a means of sustenance and well-being. So like we said, every week we start with a certain video. Is there any comments or anything that you want to add to what I just shared about that video? You can either put it in the chat or just speak out loud.
Rania made a really good point in the chat. She said that olive trees are inherited from generation to generation, and that Israel is systematically destroying the olive trees and olive groves.
Thank you, Rania. So yeah, and then Casey also, I saw you added that it's multiple generations that are passing it down. So yes, it's intergenerational. In this group of women, you saw like the singer is younger, and then we have the older, but usually the whole family is involved. And also this is actually a very famous singer, Dalal Abu Amna. She is also an activist and a scientist in Palestine. And I could say a lot about her, but well, we're gonna focus on this for now. So Alex said, just read in Pope's Ethnic Cleansing about how foreign pine trees planted by Israel are dying and olive trees are sprouting out from them. Yeah, that's a beautiful representation of, grounding in the land and ownership. Manar said the song mentions the bird bulbul, and that it's regional. I actually don't know about the song that the bird. If anyone else knows the bulbul bird. And then Nida said the call and response was heartwarming to see. It's communal. Yeah, definitely. It's always like the Palestinian folklore is in itself a very strong tradition that's passed down to this day that represents the community and upholding Palestinian tradition. Okay, so we'll share that in the PowerPoint slides as well. Great. So today our focus on our class is on History Part 1. So for agenda. So we'll be going, first we're gonna do a quick check-in. So obviously this week was a lot. So this week we finally, thankfully, got the announcement of a ceasefire agreement and that has started to go into play. So it's definitely a relief, but it also obviously brings in a lot of mixed emotions. Everyone I'm sure feels a lot all at once. So we're gonna do a little bit of check-in with that while also going over the articles that you read. We're gonna do that for about 15 minutes because then today's class will focus on part 2 of our history. So we'll go through pre-1948 Nakba up until the Naksa. So just before we start into the articles, I guess I want everyone to try to center themselves, take a minute and think about where you are in this moment. There's no wrong way to feel about what is happening and all the process because this is all happening in real time. Every day, every hour, there's a new update. So think for like 2 minutes how you're feeling. If there's anything you want to share, I know there's a lot of us, but if you want to share it in the chat, if you want to raise your hand and maybe make a comment or something you want to share to the group, we can do that now. I don't see the green, but I feel like that happens a lot when we're sharing. I'll try to stop share and bring it back. Oh, I'll try to move that. Oh, is that better?
Yes.
Thank you. Comments you want to make in the chat or or if you want to raise your hand and would rather just speak. Yeah, Alex. So Alex said, I feel like this isn't a ceasefire or end of war. Occupation is ongoing, and occupation is an offensive war posture.
We couldn't hear you, Besma.
Halima, you hear me now?
It's very
I
low.
can hear you very faintly. While you figure out your mic, I guess I'll just share what I was feeling. I feel anxious mostly, and it's centered around like this very selfish fear of never being able to meet certain members of my family, or not being able to, like there's a ceasefire, so it's like the idea is like we can go home. Like the idea is that like I can visit for the first time, and like that I don't want to miss any kind of window of opportunity to touch the land and to see where my family is. But then also feeling like there is so much just like fear of I guess anxious because I want to get to the other side of this. I want to get to the part in which the world sees and learns from Palestinians and how we rebuild and how we are these champions when it comes to overcoming our tragedies and wanting to be able to get to that part and get to the part where it all ends, but not ever knowing if that will come, but being hopeful that we will see it. So that's really where my head has been at with that.
Thanks, Halima. Yeah, definitely feeling that anxiety of it, and but also wanting to be hopeful and hoping that we can go back and be able to be there. Does anyone else want to respond to that or build off of that? Thanks for sharing, Halima. Said, I think the ceasefire was to subdue Western allies and pro-Palestine people to just calm down, but it seems like the violence hasn't stopped and is actually escalating in the West Bank. Yeah, Manad. Yeah, and I think that was a conversation among so many Palestinians, obviously in general, that and everyone has been saying the ceasefire isn't going to stop, but specifically that we're already seeing the escalations in the West Bank today in Jenin and even before that. And then, like Ronnie said, like the double standard of the media coverage is something that is still happening. A lot of great things in the chat if you wanna follow along. Abigail, I'm sorry about your sore throat. But yeah, it was very hard. Great joy for the releases, but also little acknowledgement of the horror, pain, and loss endured by the Palestinians. And also news after the first 2 days of Trump that he rescinded sanctions on settlers. So that resulted in the release of settlers, and the settler violence is happening already again. I mean, not again, it continues to happen. There's a possibility he'll restart shipment of more bombs. I didn't even know that. And then Taiko said, obviously, the fact that a ceasefire agreement has been made is welcome news, but there are still many obstacles to liberation. Any ceasefire seems tentative and volatile. And I'm also very upset about the media's focus on the hostages, while Palestinians who have also been imprisoned and held hostage are not being given the same spotlight. What is coming out about those detention centers is very frightening, and it's concerning that and with the Trump administration, how Palestinians will be treated. And then Tycho also mentioned the sanctions on the settlers, which yeah is very worrisome and scary because We talked earlier, if we talk about the trees and the farmland, they've been burning farmland and live crop. And yes, and then Shahrukh said there's a long way to go and we have to keep fighting for liberation until Palestine is free. And there's an eradication of Zionism and dismantling the existence of the Zionist state until Palestine is returned. And we achieve full liberation for Palestinians and the homeland. Thank you all. These are all really important and valid points to touch on. There's so much we can talk about. But I do appreciate all of your contributions and all of your ideas. Before we switch over to going over the articles briefly and then switching to today's focus on class, I do want to just clarify something that was discussed last class. So there was the question of how do we achieve Palestinian liberation? Obviously, first and foremost, the people on the ground, the Palestinians on the ground, are the ones leading the liberation movement, and we won't see liberation without their lead and without their activism. But for us, outside and everyone trying to figure out what can we do, we all have our own way to fight for a free Palestine. So there is no one way to do that. We all have our different avenues. We always say, going back to what we do at PAC, everyone has a role to play, and everyone has a skill set and a strength that they can use to help them put that into action. So to bring it to this conversation full circle, yes, a ceasefire agreement has been called, and yes, we might be relieved of that, but like all of us already know, the violence hasn't stopped. It continues to escalate. And this is just a reminder to all of us, this isn't a time for us to slow down. It's a time for us to use what we have and our positions and where we are and our positionality to fight for a free Palestine in whatever ways we can. And I hope that you all being in this class is one way that you're doing that. So thank you all for all of your great comments and your sharing. So with that, go back to our agenda. So right now we're gonna do like a 10-minute review. Lemia, if anyone, could you just raise your hand if you were able to read through the articles, even if it's just one of them, for this week for the two article nations. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Okay. Seeing it going up. So a couple people. Nice, I see 10 people. All right, so I'm gonna hand it over to Lemia, who's gonna just do a quick check-in on the articles and what we learned, and then we'll get into the history for today.
Okay, thank you, Vesma. So to kind of like similar to how we did last week's discussion, just because there were a lot of articles this time with the nation, for those of you that read, you can pick any article that you want to discuss, but what are some like points or some questions that you might have had that arose from reading your articles, or what's something that kind of stuck with you while you read the articles? All of these authors are Palestinians and Palestinians that have lived in Palestine and moved into the diaspora or have grown up in the diaspora. So I'd really love to hear your thoughts on how you felt reading the articles, especially like with everything that happened this week and everything that's been happening the past year. And yeah, Ella, do you want to start?
I guess so. I'm not gonna deny a hospitable request, but I read both of these articles, and I think my first comment was thinking about the dehumanization aspect, and the first one that brought multiple different authors, that was a key highlighting point. And it made me think about that a lot, especially since I just finished college last semester, and me and my colleague, we wrote an op-ed, and we just focused on the social media aspect and how social media helped actually bring the Palestinians of dehumanization. And I really liked how the authors really built upon that in their own ways from their own different backgrounds. Notably Noura Arakat from her point of view, especially since she's here in New Jersey, a professor at Princeton. So just getting her feelings and thoughts and emotions was incredibly insightful. And then obviously Muhammad al-Kurd, like every time I read him, I just get chills down my spine. I don't think I've felt like that in a long time. and his takes on it, especially his speech from the Nation, from the article. It was really not shocking, but it's just a reminder once again, the date of that speech compared to where we are now, to see that things are not, to see that things are still the same. And for me, it's just a reminder that where we are in the world, at least in the Western world, it will always be the same. The Western world has always been built upon blood and murder and bloodshed and dehumanization. And for us, it's another starking reminder that we should never expect anything different. These people will always be the same. And it also just goes to show that while we over here feel that rightfully so, we are being dehumanized, at least in other parts in the world. For example, in Malaysia or at least in the Arab countries, again, because the people are still intimately familiar with our struggles, it will always be with us. So, um, that and just another final thought is the fact that even though these are Palestinians who are from living and growing in the diaspora or have gone back to the homeland, I would love for more, I guess, translations from Palestinians themselves make it onto the media because they're still more intimately connected to the situation than we are. So I feel like their voices are also lost. Like we always talk about social media and how everyone's voices were highlighted there, but I feel like the Arabs' voices on social media, because it's all in Arabic, it hasn't been highlighted as much to the English-speaking audiences, as much as I would have liked. Which I'm grateful for the translating pages on Instagram and TikTok and stuff, because that was a godsend, really. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point. I think something important that you mentioned, a lot of these articles really do touch on the idea of media repression and how it like if it's a Palestinian voice, the media tends to take snippets of the words used and flip it around to create a like very stereotypical and very dehumanizing perspective. Another thing that you kind of mentioned that was really important is the translation of Palestinians on the ground and the words that they use and like uplifting their voices for what they share with us. I think it also kind of matches with what Muhammad Al-Kurd was saying in his Nation article where he kind of talked about um how the media and kind of social media and the world tend to take the voices of Palestinians in the diaspora more than they do of Palestinians on the ground because they try to create this like distinguish between the two of them where it's like the Palestinian in the diaspora can have this Western kind of
Flavoring
yeah,
that's
and
more
that's not like a
palatable
reality.
to the elites and the media. I thought that was very, very insightful of him to just.
Yeah.
I know that my subconscious, for him to just lay it out like that, it was like whoa,
No,
like
that was really good. Yeah, I think that was a really important point because that's something that we don't really talk about as often is this like barrier that forms between or the barrier that the media tries to form between diaspora Palestinians and Palestinians on the ground. And I think that was really important to touch because it's not that we're different or like there's a separation between us. It's that the media tries to twist that narrative even though it's not a reality. Does anyone? Oh, Shahrukh, do you want to go?
I agree with what you both just said. I want to point out that in our society that we're living in today, you know, like what you just mentioned, what these orders are literally Palestinian. Like they literally want their voice to, they literally want the whole world to hear their voice. Uplift their voice, right? They're not like being biased. They're literally telling from what they witnesses throughout their childhood. So, like this is like before when Nakba happened, this is what they've been going through. Like, and now they want to like reach out their reach out their voice to the whole world. But the thing is, like, again, they're literally one sided again. Like it just the so-called Zionists, like they're the always one that's always been victim. Yeah, like even in the protests, like barely Zionists barely get detained, but what they do to Palestinian in out in the streets. So it's always it's always the Palestinian that they frame as villains. So, the police don't do anything about it. They like just let him get let the Zionists get away with the victim card. So, that's why they're like the Palestinian voice are always shush, like they just none of the world would even want to take a second to listen listen to what the Palestinians are even saying from their perspective, from their point of view. So yeah, from their point of view. So, again, that's just go to say that just goes to say that this is dehumanization in real time and uncivilized. Like what happened in, like, let's say, you know, this is kind of relevant, but remember, like, when Ukraine war happened in 2022, like, what all media sided with Ukraine, but not with the Palestinian, that was a double standards and hypocrisy. So that just goes to shows that this is the reality, this is the society we're living in today. But
Yeah.
we shall, we shall never. But this goes to reminds us that we should we should always stick to amplify the voice, the one that are the actual victim, not fake victim. Zionists are Zionists are always going to play that. So because we can literally tell that who's the victim and who's not the victim. So that's one of Zionist bias, but not the Palestinian, because they know that end of the day they're telling the truth. Even but the whole world doesn't even lift a finger, not because they know they're just gonna look away eventually. Like every time, every time a resistance fighter like a resistance fighter fight back for their land, like kept fight against from settlers, then whole world gets concerned, like, or the whole world starts to get concerned at what they'd be like, what the Palestinian people are doing to Zionists,
So,
Israelis, like.
so one thing that is actually in the comments that's really good. Thank you for that. Shout out is like Casey said it, and that goes hand in hand with that. That she said there's been a call throughout the genocide to allow Western journalists into Gaza, but we have the Palestinians on the ground in Gaza reporting. What's wrong? Why are their reports not as valid? So I think that goes right with that, right? That we want to make sure, like, why aren't their voices validated and why are they dehumanized and why is there this double standard? And right before that, Manan made a really good point too, which is Muhammad al-Kurd, which I think he always does a great job of. He's very unapologetic for one, and he always challenges this notion of how we see Palestinians. And like so, Manan, I'm gonna just go through your note because I think that's really important. That he challenges the reader how we're introduced, that he said those of us who are terrorists or articulated to be terrorists. So the Arab and Palestinians are always seen in that light, no matter what. And then he talks about it doesn't matter like what we do, we're gonna be called that. So for example, Shireen Abu Akla, she was a Palestinian American journalist. She was still shot and killed by Israel, and he won't use her American status to say, she should have been more humanized. In general, we are dehumanized. And then there's a few comments, but I know Halima had her hand up next, and then we had a few other hands up. Thanks, Sharaf.
I think a few things that stood out to me was I never really thought about how, like, truly there are no credentials needed for any kind of Israeli to speak. When they were mentioning that in the article about how and he was talking about how, like, I was always aware of how we needed to humanize ourselves or be, or talk about what great things we do that make us worthy of speaking, versus how, like, there whenever an Israeli is being interviewed, it's like or like videos are being highlighted of them speaking, there's not much, you don't need a credential, it's just that they are Israeli and that's good enough. And when he was talking about how I don't need the history, I don't need to go into the history to tell you, like, my experience and how my experience is valid enough. And and how Nora in the other article was talking about how she was so upset with herself because she had called out the producer for asking racist questions and then felt like she had missed an opportunity for a Palestinian to speak, and the amount of pressure that we put on ourselves. And I really appreciated how in the article of who is a Palestinian, nobody really defined what it was to be Palestinian. Everyone was just sharing their individual experiences versus being like, this is what it looks like or sounds like to be Palestinian. And so like, those are a few things that I really appreciated. And I think also this, how like men really do get so lost in the conversation because they need to be women and children for us to sympathize with them. And I just kept thinking about how when I was at a high school tabling and we asked people the question of what it means to be Palestinian. And I think even Abir did it in the first class where she's like, let's not just focus on the death of Palestinians. Like what do we know of Palestine? And I think it also just, really doubles down on the fact that like I always thought about how people think about how I was like, do people just think that everyone in Palestine is just poor and doesn't have any kind of life worth saving? And like just really shows us how like we also in the Western world treat people in poverty and how like we think that if they don't have any life that even assembles our life, that their life isn't worth saving because we can't empathize with them on loss. Like we think they have nothing to lose, but in reality, it's just like another. It just also points like how humanization is also tied to capitalism as well. So that's those are my thoughts.
I think that's actually a really good point because it kind of also shows how a lot of these systems that are used to oppress multiple people from different identities are very interconnected, and kind of come together to continue the dehumanization of people of color and people who are oppressed. Abigail, you had your hands up?
Hi, sorry, I always can't find the audio button. I'm going to say something, and I hope that it's taken in the way that it's meant. One of my concerns or one of the reasons I think that the Palestinians in the diaspora are sometimes listened to a little bit more is because they are more European or Western. Their tone, they're not shrill. So often, I want to say to some of the people speaking from Palestine, take it down a notch. You're shrill. It's offensive to I'll just say American ear. And not to say that people have to be different than who they are, but I think you always have to be conscious of the audience you're talking to. And so you see that so many of the Israelis, obviously, they're of European descent. So that's immediately different. Not all, but most of the ones that are speaking, educated, most of them in either the UK or here, mostly the UK. And so, like, if you listen to Dr. Hassam Zolat, the ambassador to the UK, he is incredibly passionate, angry, says what has to be said, but he says it in a way that can be heard by the Western audience. And that's the audience I think we're talking about. So I think that that needs to be put into consideration. One of my favorite lines that Layla Al Haddad said when Anthony Bourdain was going to Gaza with her, you remember the chef who traveled all around and had the show. And he was going to Gaza with her, and she was taking him to her father's house or to her home. And she said, he's going to sound like he's angry at you, but he's not. That's just the way we talk. And I think that sort of encapsulated the thing that makes me crazy is the choice of pictures that the media often chooses. It's either incredibly victimhood or anger. And when we were doing the apartheid free campaign and we were looking for the pictures to put out front, we were all very conscious of that. Um, and it's just, I think, something that has to be taken into consideration. Of course, I come from a PR head, so
Thank you, Abigail. So to address that. Thank you for your input, but and tell me if I'm wrong here. The issue with what you're saying, though, I think, and it addresses what we're talking about, is that just because Palestinians are upset or angry, there's a reason. So I don't like I don't think it has to be that we shouldn't have to make it more catered and more diplomatic,
I'm
so
not
that we
saying
can
that
get
the
to
anger isn't
people.
real, and the anger can't be is real and legitimate. I mean, I think you would know me well enough to know. Look at that sweet boy. Um, um, what I'm saying is that I think sometimes, if you listen to Muhammad Elker, he is soft, but but he's strong. He's saying things that are full of anger and whatever, but his delivery is different. That's I'm purely talking about delivery. Not he needs no. um it's the delivery that I'm talking about that I think is hard for certain audiences to hear or to and it's just a thought that I have when I see
Yeah,
when I
yeah,
want them to be
and
heard. I want them to be heard, and I think sometimes they shoot themselves in the foot.
yes, but and Carol, I'm seeing your comment here, and when you say like a PR perspective, okay, that's fine, but I think that's the problem with what everyone is addressing, that we have to always, and Hanima said it earlier too, that we have to always think about how we're speaking, what we're saying, are we using facts, are we using our history, but why do we have to do that? Whereas if it were someone else, if they just screamed their opinion and said how we're feeling, then great, we're going to get accepted. But when it comes to Palestinians, why do we have to think about how we're being presented? This is how we're feeling. And I think that actually is the issue that they're saying. Why do we have to put on this PR presentable face for everyone, for the world? But
I kind of just want to say
no.
something to challenge our perspective on what we see as anger and delivery. So I was born and raised here, and I lived in Egypt for a little bit, but I literally grew up in the US and I have seen white men be praised for their anger, for how manly they are. You know, we have a president that just got sworn in that a lot of people say, I don't even care about his politics. I just like the way he says it like it is. And so I actually want us to challenge what we perceive as aggressive and angry, because in the United States, especially, anger and aggressiveness has been the language of the people since the beginning, in a lot of ways. And I think, like, I remember when people were saying how Obama is so articulate, and it really comes from a racialized view where they didn't expect him to be articulate. That man was still deporting people and bombing people in Somalia, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, and Iraq, right? And so I don't think we have to focus on delivery, because I think Halima said it, like, we're damned if we do or we're damned if we don't. But at the same time, I think there's this Orientalist view that when we're angry, we are so much worse, or we are, you know, we're presented as anger from a violence automatically, even though some of it is justified anger. But when someone in the US is a politician and they start, you know, snapping, they're like, wow, look at his passion, especially when we're talking about the patriarchy and racialization. If Obama was as passionate as Trump, he would have never got elected, whether we agree with the politics or not. So I just would want us to challenge our perspective of what we see as anger might actually be us perpetuating racialized or Orientalist views that don't necessarily get applied to the American population.
Thank you, Manad. Thanks everyone. And I think this is a good point for us to shift in, Great job, Manal. Thank you. So thank you all for your comments. I am reading them all, but just for time's sake, we can't address everything, but I do appreciate everyone's comments and contributions. So we're gonna shift back to our class. And if you didn't get a chance to read those, I highly suggest you do. They are great. All the articles are wonderful. And I'm just gonna go back to sharing. Okay. So we're gonna start with the focus of today's course. There is a lot, so please bear with me, and I hope you can be patient with me as we get through. We might have to go a little faster, a little slower, depending on what it is. So feel free to raise your hand if you have questions or put them in the chat. For time's sake, if something comes up or if you have a question or a comment about something, if it's not directly needed to be addressed in the moment, if you can hold off either by putting it in the chat or waiting so we can address it at the end, just so we in the end, just so we can make sure we're getting to all the material for today. And also I do want to give a shout out to Ahmadiyab Mustafa. Ahmadiyab is the board president at PAC, and he's actually on with us today, and we always appreciate him being with us, and he's here to just to support and to answer any additional questions because he is much more of an expert than me. I am a humble student and learning, so I'm really excited to be with you for this class and lead this discussion, but of course we are all always learning.
Thank you, Basma. I'm actually learning a lot already. Thank
you, Amma. I'm teaching. I gotta start. Okay, so to get us started, so we're gonna start. So first, just to center us, we did this a little last week, but we'll be talking about Zionism, and tying that in with the British Empire. So we're gonna play the video. It always does this. Okay, interesting fact, this started happening like post-genocide, so much of it.
What is Zionism? Zionism is a political and national movement aimed at creating and sustaining a Jewish state in the Middle East. Now, according to many traditional and Orthodox Jewish teachings, Jews are forbidden by God to have their own state until their Messiah comes. But this hasn't stopped Zionism from pushing towards that very goal. So where did this all start? Let's go back to 1897. A man named Theodor Herzl formed the World Zionist Organization. He advocated for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine and is even mentioned in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. It was tough to be a Jew in Europe in that time. With anti-Semitic sentiments rising, Herzl felt the only way for his people to live in peace was for them to have their own country. Palestine was chosen, and a popular slogan started spreading around the world: a land without a people, for a people without a land. The only problem was, Palestine wasn't a land without a people. A large number of Muslims and Christians, along with a smaller number of Jews, had been living there together in peace for centuries. But for many Christian Zionists living in the West and Jewish Zionists living in Europe, that made little difference. Following the fall of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, and along with British support, Jewish immigration to the newly British-occupied Palestine was steady in the early 20th century. Then there was a turning point: World War II. Following the Holocaust, the flow of Jews to occupied Palestine boomed, and many Western countries began backing the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. Although a UN resolution recommended both an independent Arab and Jewish state in the region, Israel went ahead and declared their independence in 1948 and was recognized by US President Harry Truman that very same day. The Zionist movement had achieved its main victory. In the period after its establishment, Israel carried out an invasion of neighboring countries, and at the end of 1967's Six-Day War, Israel extended its control in the region, displacing countless Christian and Muslim Palestinians. A year later, the 28th World Zionist Congress adopted the Jerusalem Program, a list of 5 goals, which are the current makeup of modern Zionism: the unity of the Jewish people and the centrality of Israel in Jewish life, the ingathering of the Jewish people in its historic homeland, the strengthening of the State of Israel, which is based on the prophetic vision of justice and peace, the preservation of the identity of the Jewish people through the fostering of Jewish and Hebrew education, and the protection of Jewish rights everywhere. In practice, their goals of justice and peace have been lost to many of the non-Jewish people living in the region. The Israeli military has been illegally controlling and occupying much of Palestine, and constant new illegal settlement building on Palestinian land by the Zionist state has been condemned by much of the international community. So what do you think about Zionism?
Okay, so that was a bit of an overview of Zionism. So Zionism is a political and nationalistic ideology. It's rooted in white supremacy and genocide, and it supports and sustains the Jewish state of Israel in occupied Palestinian territories. So just to give a little bit of a background there and go over what was gone over in the video, if we want to start with how did all of this start, you can go back and back, but so basically in the beginning, in Europe, prior to the establishment of Israel and Palestine, or even the establishment of Zionism, many Jews were living in Europe. They were for much of the time segregated into ghettos until the French Revolution, when the integration of Jews started to happen. And Theodor Herzl, who is the founder of Zionism, was actually a big proponent in the community. In the beginning, Theodor Herzl actually did push for Jews to live amongst the people in Europe. He would even recommend that Jews hide their Judaism and convert if they're discovered. And he was a very problematic character. But then, if you remember your history from school, the Dreyfus Affair happened. To summarize, in the Dreyfus Affair, he was a Jewish man, and he was accused of a crime and jailed, only to later discover that he was innocent, but the reason he was blamed for it was simply because he was Jewish. So this incident sparked Theodor Herzl's decision and his opinion on Jewish assimilation. So whereas he had previously thought we want to assimilate, and he would push people to do this, he realized we don't want to assimilate because it's not going to happen, and our community is not going to get the support that we want through that. So then he decided we need a nation state, and he started to form and advocate and lobby for this Zionist state. And in 1897, he organized the first Zionist conference. And this was actually talked about in our last class, at least with my group. Many of us were saying, like, why Palestine? Different places were actually suggested. So at one point it was Argentina, Uganda, I think there were others. And then it was decided on Palestine because Palestine was essentially the best sell. So you talk about like a land without people for people without a land. So it was used because of its religious like the religious significance and the fact that it's a promised land. So it was convenient to say, well, let's choose Palestine. And doing this migration to Palestine would solve the problem of anti-Semitism that was happening in Europe, and the racism that's happening against the Jewish community. Okay, questions before I continue? Okay, so I'll keep going. So then we had.
Sorry, I do have a question.
Yes.
My question is, so we know that there were other lands proposed, but in the indoctrination within Zionists, do they know that other lands were proposed? Or is that something that's erased from the indoctrination that they're told?
That is a good question. Ahmadiab, do you know?
I honestly don't have the answer to that question, but I know that this idea was really discussed, even was presented in the first Zionist Congress. That idea of having the Israel state in Africa was discussed, but it was turned down. And Herzl himself was one of the advocates for it because he had the French government, which had controlled that area, had promised them to make it easy for them to create their state there. And keep in mind that in 1897, Palestine was not even under any mandate. It was under the Ottoman Empire. So it was almost like Mission Impossible that they were looking for. So and again, keep in mind that the reason they wanted to create a state is the anti-Semitism that was very real in Europe, and all the persecution that the Jewish community faced in Europe made them think that they will not be safe unless they have a place of their own, and that's why they were open to different places. But to answer your question, I honestly don't. I would be surprised if they teach them that, because their main point is that this is the only place and it's a promised land. So I will be surprised if that's taught, but I cannot say no for sure.
Thank you, Amon. So then we switch over between the 1800s and 1916. So like I said, there's a lot of back history even with the Ottoman Empire and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, but just for time's sake we are kind of jumping to more of the modern day history of it. But we will suggest some text after this class if you want to do further and deeper research. So then we had the Sykes-Picot Treaty. So Sykes-Picot this was a secret convention during World War I, and it was between Britain and Russia. Britain and France with the participation of Russia, that discussed the fall of the Ottoman Empire and what they would essentially do to it. To simplify it, prior to this, the Palestine wasn't officially Palestine because this is often one of the Zionist talking points that you didn't have Palestine, but you did. It's just that the nationalism and nations and states was more of a modern thing that came about. So we had Bilad al-Sham. So Palestine was there. It's just that we didn't have the same kind of borders. And correct me if I'm not explaining this right, Ahmadiyya. So then, with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, you split the Arab states into zones, and then each empire had one zone. So this was with this, British basically took over Palestine. And then to jump in 1917. Okay, and then to jump, this is the Balfour Declaration. Many of you are probably familiar with this, if not all of you. So before I even go into what this, so actually I'll just say this was a public pledge by Britain in 1917, declaring its aim to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, and it was between Arthur Balfour and Lionel Walter Rothschild. So I hope everyone can see it well. If I could just have one person either raise their hand or say in the chat something that sticks out to them in the language of this declaration, and I'll read it out loud. So, dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. So, something you notice in this document?
Definitely the second paragraph about not compromising the civil and religious rights of the already existing communities over there. It actually reminded me of something I took in one of my classes. We were going over the self-determination rights listed in the UN. I think it was either UN Treaty or UN Declaration or whatever charter, and that was actually something that was noted in there. That for an occupier to come and take over another country, they are allowed to, but they can't really jeopardize those civil, religious, human rights. So I find that very, very interesting to say the least.
Okay. Yes. Yes, you're true. You're right. Thank you. But I actually, it's interesting you pointed that out because I made a note of that, but not for the same reason. Do they say the religious and civil rights of the Palestinians or even of the Arabs? No, they say the non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So this is actually very intentional, and this even goes back to a conversation we can have about today. The language that was used is very intentional. So we're deliberately going to erase Palestinian. If you see for much of the history, they're not called Palestinians, they're called the Arabs. Here they're called non-Jewish, so we're not even going to acknowledge their existence as Arabs or Palestinians. And this is something that happens today when you look at the Palestinian prisoners, for example, political prisoners. We're called prisoners, whereas many of them are abducted and taken hostage without committing any crime. And this is really important because this was from its establishment to today. And then just to switch over, why did the British government issue the Balfour Declaration? There were a few different reasons. So, and why did they back the establishment? First, it was to create a friendly colonial country. So this was basically, it was in their self-interest, in Europe's interest and the British Empire's interest to have them be in alliance with them and have them there. It was in the heart of the Arab world, so it actually deliberately prevented an established unified Arab state. And the British actually considered the Zionist movement as their colonial project. And then switching over. The Balfour Declaration was essentially the green light for the Zionist movement to officially begin. And I'm gonna play a quick video. It's actually really interesting here, and then we could go over it.
Ladies and gentlemen, the toast is health and long life to the Right Honorable Lloyd George. Member of Parliament. It is, as your chairman has reminded you, it is nearly 16 years since he recruited me to the Zionist movement. The fertilizing stream pouring steadily into Palestine of energy, wealth, zeal, intelligence, brains, laving the thirsty land and vitalizing its withered strength. Barren and malarial swamps have been converted into happy settlements. Science has been harnessed to waters which had been running wild and waste since the early days of creation.
So I just thought that was interesting to include and play. So this was a liberal leader, Lloyd George, at a Zionist dinner, just reaffirming his faith in the policy of the Jewish national home. So this really was a movement that was with the support of the British, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that and how this couldn't have come about or happened without their support.
May I add a few things?
Yes, please.
Okay, I just want to highlight a few points about the Balfour Declaration. One, the first point that in 1917, Britain had no control or mandate over Palestine. So when they gave that promise to the Zionist movement that they will help them create a homeland for them in Palestine, Palestine was still under the Ottoman Empire, and Britain had zero control over Palestine. The second point is that at that time, the Jewish population in Palestine, including the one that the Zionist movement were able to move, and the lands they were able to buy, because the Zionist movement was since after 1887, 1897, and even before, they were trying to buy land in Palestine and move people to Palestine. Their numbers, I don't have the exact percentage, but I believe it was maybe less than 5% of the population, and their control of the land was very, very minimum, maybe 2% or 3% of the land. So imagine a country that does not even have control over another place, promise it to a group of people who don't own any part of the land, a very small part, and they don't represent a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of the population. But that's what happened in the Balfour Declaration. Now, why was the Balfour Declaration very, very huge turning point in the Palestinian struggle and had huge damaging effect on the Palestinian struggle? Is that when Britain, after the First World War, and Britain taking the mandate on Palestine, and part of the mandate was that Britain will rule Palestine until the Palestine is ready to be its own state, like they did with all the other states. After a while, all the other states had their own governments and their own liberation and their own entity. That Balfour Declaration became almost like the book or the playbook, and that Britain used in Palestine. So British mandate in Palestine between whenever they took over, I think 1918 or 1920 till 1948 when they withdrew. Their job was to make the Balfour Declaration a reality. And I'm sure Bassem is going to get into how they did that. And one of the things they made to make it even the law, after First World War, the League of Nations was created. The League of Nations was the United Nations before the United Nations became the United Nations. So the United Nations was created to replace the League of Nations. The League of Nations, when they gave the mandate and they approved that Britain can have the mandate of Palestine, the Balfour Declaration was included in that mandate and became almost like the law. So the British government during that period of time, their job was to facilitate making the Balfour Declaration a reality. Now, these are my points.
Thank you, Amo. All right, so to continue from there, so post-War One leadership shifts under the British mandate. So the impact was under the British mandate, and Zionists. So we talked about like the land started being taken slowly, and the migration of Jewish population was slowly happening under the British mandate. In terms of the Palestinians, so prior to this, political power was within like elite like clan. There was like a clan system, and then we started to shift to urban elites or ayan, and then wealthy landowners and families. And so there were essentially a number of families that were in power prior to this. So within Jerusalem, some of them were Hussein al-Khalidi and Nashishibi family, and then in Nablus there was Abdul Hadi, Tuqan, and the Nimr families. So you see that there's rivalries between the families, and this later on and continued to affect Palestinian politics and the dynamics of the leadership. So initially when the British mandate took over, there were many Palestinians that were in support of the British, and they allied with them, hoping that the British would actually help facilitate their independence. But instead, British kind of, and you can correct me for this, Amal, but from what my understanding is that the British really played both sides. So they would promise the Arabs, the Palestinians, independence and support, but then in reality, they were making all these deals to help establish Israel as a state and help the Jewish migration and for them to take over control and power. So then we had a Palestinian national movement during this period, and this was a period of early resistance, as the Zionist group started to take more control. So this was between 1918 to 1929. So Palestinian elites, and then even the people were realizing more the colonial nature of Zionism, and that this was becoming a problem to the existence of Palestine, especially after the start of the land sales. So after World War I, there was the establishment of what were the Muslim Christian associations, and these were to start to oppose the Zionist and British policies of Jewish migration and land sales. And then between 1919 and 1927, there were a period of Palestinian Arab National Congresses being held between the Palestinian leadership. They made different steps to maintaining Palestinian independence. But so in 1919, the first Congress, this formally rejected the Balfour Declaration and the British Mandate, and they called for unity with Syria, which is like a whole other thing. And then in 1922, a couple years later, they had the Fifth Congress, where they actually boycotted the British Legislative Council, opposed the land sales and Zionist immigration. And in 1927, you had the Seventh. But by then, so you kept having these congresses being held, but there was a decline in their effectiveness and their power because there wasn't political unity. And that's when I mentioned the families, because there were rivalries and factions within the leadership. So then there were periods of Palestinian resistance to the growing Zionist movement. So in 1929, this was one of the strongest. So in the 1929 uprisings, you had Al Burak uprising, which started with the Wailing Wall incident. So there were demonstrations happening by Zionist groups. So there was the movement to take over and have their own their own establishment in Al-Aqsa Masjid. So Al-Aqsa was protected for Palestinians, and this was actually supposed to be upheld by the British. So Zionist groups were demonstrating and complaining about this because they wanted to go in and worship, even though it was protected for the Muslims then. So this resulted in clashes between Zionists and Palestinians in Jerusalem, and then the British army actually came in and supported the Zionist groups, even though in fact legally it was supposed to be protected for Muslims. And then the British army had clashes with Palestinians. Zionist extremists turned this into a national campaign, and it resulted in violence throughout Jerusalem, Jaffa, Haifa, and Nablus. And this resulted in widespread casualties. And actually, the British, under this, they tried 1,000 people, and 25 Palestinians were sentenced to death for it, and only one Jewish person was. So there was, this is just an example of how there was this disparity between how the British Army treated Palestinians versus how they were treating the Jewish groups coming in. So next, there was in 1930 to 1935 the emergence of different political parties. So this was mentioned before, but we had different forms of leadership within Palestinians. So the traditional leadership was elite families. So for example, like the families mentioned earlier, they were anti-Zionist, but many of the leaders within these elite families were still pro-British. And there were different reasons. First, many of them still had hope that the British would support them. But also there was also self-serving interest because they had their own alliances, and they still had the hope that if they stuck to supporting the British and hoping that the British will help facilitate the establishment of a state, they would be able to rule in that regard. Whereas then we also had the New Youth leadership, and these were middle class, radical leadership. They were educated, and some of them actually pursued secret and armed resistance as well. Next, you had in 1936 to 1939, the Great Revolt. So key causes of this. So at this point, Palestinians were fearful of the growing Zionist land acquisition and Jewish immigration. There was also a lot of economic hardship prior to this in 1929. So there was land dispossession, there was poor harvest. So the lower class was really getting affected by this. So this is what led to the Great Revolt. So the Arab National Committee first declared a strike in the city of Jaffa, which led to other committees forming, and then what was called the Arab Higher Committee. A general strike spread out throughout Palestine, and then many armed Palestinian groups were formed, and then it started the Great Palestinian Revolt. The leadership of the national movement, so the elite families, so Husseini and others, they were criticized because they were not part of this. This revolt was really by the lower class and the peasants, because they were the ones facing the hardship here. So this caused divisions within the movement. Many people were seeing the weakness of the movement and saw that the leadership was not helping them when this happened. And then the families themselves were having these divisions and factions between the families, which again further weakened the movement. So all of this, Palestinians and were further weakened, and at the same time you had the growing acquisition of land to the Zionist groups and the immigration increase. So in the beginning this was being facilitated by the British, and then it kept growing to the point that it almost got out of hand for the British. So this all set up the stage for the Nakba and the establishment of Israel. So for the sake of time, I think a lot of the video is actually what we're gonna go over. So I won't play the video, but I do think you should watch it, especially if you're a visual learner. But we'll go over the key points here. So in 1948, you had the establishment of the Nakba, but everything happening before this, it didn't, like, what's really important that you have to remember is that there was a lot happening that led up to this. It didn't just happen in a vacuum, and I hope everything we've been discussing today kind of reinforces and builds upon that. So 1948 was the official establishment of the Nakba. I just want to go through. Okay, so what's the prelude to that? So first we had the partition plan. So in 1937, you had the Peel Commission, which proposed dividing Palestine, but this was rejected. Oh, sorry, I didn't fix that, but by both groups. This was rejected by all. And then you had the UN Resolution 181 in 1947, which partitioned Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. And then this was actually rejected by all parties. And then from 47 to 48, you had a very high rise in Zionist violence. So Zionist militias were launching preemptive attacks before the 1948 Nakba. There were ethnic cleansing campaigns happening throughout, and this really just set the stage for the Nakba to happen. And the strategy was called Plan Dalei, which is a military strategy that actually displaced 250,000 Palestinians even before the 1948 Nakba. And this just made it easier. It weakened the Palestinians further and caused this. Oh, sorry, I forgot to skip that slide. Sorry about that. Okay, just go back. All right. And then with that, that led to the 1948 Nakba in May 15th, which is when the British mandate officially ended. Israel declared their independence, and then the Nakba happened, so the catastrophe, and Israel came in. Their tactics were military conquests, massacres, psychological terror, and forced displacement. And there were a few key massacres that were really they just show you the tactics in which Israel used. So for example, The Deir Yassin massacre happened in April. 254 Palestinians were killed, but it wasn't just that they were killed, this was done in the most brutal of ways. If you've seen any documentary, if you've heard any eyewitness accounts, they did horrible, horrible things. And then then they would purposefully spread that news, and they'd want Palestinians to spread it. So then other villages were so scared, like, we don't want what to happen to us, what happened in Deir Yassin or Tantura or wherever it is. So it led to the out of fear, other Palestinian villages and villagers to flee. And then another example of that is Tantura and Dawaima. So it was the mass killing of Palestinians, the destruction of villages, the desecration of sites. They raped women. They shot families point blank, and they destroyed 531 villages that were completely bulldozed and systematically erased from the Nakba. And I think this was all, like, not only was it obviously the violence that they committed, but also the psychological terror. So we're gonna talk later in this class about, like, the Zionist playbook, but they'll often say, like, Palestinians left, but if you look at what they did, why did they leave? And this is also a good point I want to plug. We do have a Nakba documentary. If we can put that in the WhatsApp, if I forget, someone put it in the WhatsApp. We had a 30-minute Nakba documentary where we interviewed people in the community. PAC produced this, and you hear the eyewitness accounts of what they've had to go through, and it was horrible. Before I go into, so this is also this is just a map to visually show you. So again, this didn't happen only in 48, but it was slowly happening before. So in 1945, 1,000 plus Palestinian towns and villages, like, if you see how much the numbers dropped, were taken, then you lose 220 at least, then another 300. So almost half of the population was forced to leave over this point, this period of the Nakba. And then this also is a really important map that you could see. I think we've talked about this before, but just to show you, like, the Nakba as an event happened in 48, but it's been systematic, and I think I'm going to bring that up later, but this will just show you the land loss, how dramatic it shifts. So from the yellow was Palestinian, and then blue is Israeli, and you see so dramatically between 1917 and then to 48, and then we'll talk later in the class about how much this keeps going. So following the Nakba, something else that arose was Palestinian refugees. So the scale of displacement, so often the numbers do say 750,000 Palestinians were displaced during the Nakba, but this is something I learned more recently. That's very interesting. 750,000 is the number that is registered with the UN. So there were other Palestinians that fled. It's more 900,000 is the more accurate number for that, but they didn't have to flee as refugees. Essentially, they had other families or other citizenships or other places they can go. And this was more of the higher class. So, for example, like Edward Said's family, when they left, they had the privilege, they didn't have to flee as refugees because they had family outside of Palestine and support. So there were other Palestinians. So the UN registered number 750,000, but in the reality is those displaced were 900,000. And they were all dispersed into neighboring countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and then also beyond, so later even West Africa, and then later on North America. And then these are just some challenges that are faced. By Palestinian refugees, is resource scarcity, obviously. A lot of because of the number and what they're facing, resources were low. There was also the hesitancy to dissolve for Palestinians to, have to give up their Palestinian identity, and then also the pressure that surrounds it. Many Palestinians also struggled with homelessness while also trying to preserve their identity. So there's always been this idea for many Palestinians that had to go to the refugee camp that, like, even if they later on were able to leave the refugee camp, psychologically they are still in that. And then something really important to highlight is UNRWA. The United Nations established UNRWA, and uh, people have different opinions about UNRWA, but UNRWA was really a lifeline for Palestinians and still is. It was established to provide education, healthcare, and relief, and it defines refugees as those displaced between 46 and 48 during the Nakba. It was actually later expanded because, as we all know, the Nakba is systematic and Palestinians continued to become refugees. And UNRWA still operates to this day. They have 58 camps. This is the last number I saw. And UNRWA helps preserve the right of return. So this is protected under UN Resolution 194, even though Israel denies it. And you can see how much Israel attacks UNRWA. If you all remember, last year, yeah, it's crazy that it's already last year that Israel started to attack UNRWA and said that they're involved in terrorist activities and tried to cut funding. And this is so problematic because Palestinians rely on UNRWA. I know Ahmed, yeah, but I feel like we always talk about this if you want to add anything about the importance of UNRWA for Palestinians.
Yeah. UNRWA is very important, and the scary thing is that if you guys remember when Trump first term, one of the things he did is he did cut funding to UNRWA, and now he's back, and this time Israel outlawed UNRWA to work in Palestine, and they put in all the pressure on them. And if Trump goes back with his policy, which, by the way, Biden reversed that policy, it's going to affect the Palestinian refugees very, very bad. And like Basma said, that the UNRWA is what maintains all the Palestinian refugees. All the Palestinian services and for the Palestinians that live in the refugee camps are through UNRWA. A lot of the doctors that we have in our community, they graduated from here in the U.S. They graduated from the UNRWA schools because the refugees are very well known in the Palestinian community. They love education because that's the way for them to get out of the life of the camp and the life of poverty into leadership in the Palestinian society. But Basma, if you allow me, I wanted to say a few things about the before the Nakba, and also tying it to what's happening right now. I'll try to make it very quick. Is that okay, or you don't have time?
No, of course, Hamo, go ahead, please.
Okay. Yeah, one thing that I wanted to say is the number of like we said, with the Balfour Declaration, the British mandate was working day and night to facilitate the creation of the State of Israel, or the homeland for the Jews in Palestine. Because that was the Balfour Declaration. And with all that, with everything that the Jewish Zionist movement was doing, with everything that the British government was doing, they were not able to convince a lot of the Jews to move into Palestine. One of the things that turned things around was the Holocaust and what happened in Germany. And at the beginning, before the Holocaust, when Hitler wanted to get rid of the Jews, one of the things that he allowed the Zionist movement, he did a deal with the Zionist movement that any Jewish that lives in Germany that wants to leave voluntarily, they could leave to Israel. They could leave with everything they own. So that moved a lot of money and a lot of talent into Israel. But then also when the Holocaust started, most of the world in Europe and in the United States, they closed their borders to the Jewish community. So if a Jewish that was trying to flee the Holocaust wanted to come to the United States or to any other place in Europe, they're turned back. And the only place that would take them was Israel. So they also became almost like the place that these Jews fleeing the Holocaust had to go. And this is what the Zionist movement always tries to portray, that Israel is the only place where the Jews can be safe, and it's the only place that they can be protected. So this is one thing that, because after the Holocaust, that's when they reached the the number that they always were trying to reach, which is about 30% of the population in Palestine. Now, the second thing that I wanted to say that during the Nakba, what happened really in the Nakba, like if you wanna look about the meaning of the Nakba is a catastrophe. So I would say the catastrophe started with the Balfour Declaration and maybe even before. And but what distinguishes what happened in 1948, and that's when that term came up, the Nakba, is the displacement of the Palestinians. Because now Israel managed to move a good number of the Jewish community into Palestine to live that dream of creating a Jewish state, but they have a big problem. Most of the land is owned still by the Palestinians, and most of the population is still Palestinian. So how can you create a Jewish state, create an inter-reality in a place that's population is dominantly Palestinians, Muslims, and Christians, and the land ownership is dominantly by Palestinian Muslims and Christians or some Arabs. So the only way to do that was what happened in 1948, which is the war, and in that war they kicked out 50% of the total, about 50% of the total population of all historic Palestine. And that number is close, I believe, to 80% of the people that lived in what's known as the 1948 Palestine. So imagine a land that they were able, when they created their state, they were not able to create their state till they kicked out 80% of the population that live in that area and confiscated their land. And that's how this thing happened. Now, the thing that I want to tie it to what's happening right now is with Trump taking over, the same way Britain gave the Balfour Declaration, and the same way Trump gave Israel the right to annex or recognize the annexation of Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, he might be in his way to give Israel the green light to annex part of the West Bank, if not all of the West Bank, at least maybe Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank. And this is very, very dangerous because they have that power. Superpowers in the world have that power. Britain gave out the Balfour Declaration that was the most damaging thing to the Palestinians before they even had any control over Palestine. And the United States now, I think it's I hope not, but I think it's on its way to help Israel annex a huge part of the West Bank. These are the things I want to say, Basma.
Thank you, Amor. We appreciate you. I hope that's not happening, but yeah, I think, yeah, and that actually goes right into our next slide. So one thing that's really important, for refugees. So many people ask, what do refugees want? This goes back to our Freedom is the Future original class, which what do Palestinians want? And one of them is the right of return. And that the right of return is central to Palestinian liberation. We're going to link it in the Google Classroom, but there's actually, if you look up, if you're interested in learning more about, what this looks like and the right of return in general, Dr. Salman Abu Sitta does a great job of writing about this in his book. And he also, he did a lecture with us for the conference. We'll post a link to that if you want to learn about this in more detail. And he actually maps out how we can really see the right of return happen. It's really interesting.
Yeah, that's not just want to press one point, which I said it, but I want to really press it again. That when Israel says that Palestinians left alone or they had no intention of do whatever they did, that was the plan all along. Britain prepared them, gave them everything they need to do the job, which is displace the Palestinians and take their land. So displacing the Palestinians that became refugees, and that's why the right of return is very, very, very important in the Palestinian struggle, because that's where the real story happened. They kicked us out and they confiscated the land, and they've been doing it since. In the West Bank, for anybody that went to the West Bank or lived in the West Bank, in 1967 there was 0 settlements. Now we have over 800,000 settlers and settlements everywhere, surrounding every village in Palestine. So the story was and is, and the plan always, to confiscate the land and kick the people out And that's what they're trying to do also in Gaza. But thank God it did not go through yet. And I wouldn't be surprised that they will keep pushing people to move voluntarily in Gaza after the war stops, and they will say, "Hey, they left by in the history books. If this stays there in the history books in the future, they will say, oh, the Palestinians used, Hamas attacked us in October 7. We had to defend ourselves. There was 7 Arab armies. Now they will say armies about what's happening right now. The same story they say in 1967. All the Arab armies together in 1967 were less than the Israeli forces that were trained, well equipped, ready to fight in 1948. The same way right now that you have a nuclear weapon power supported by the United States, fighting groups, resistant groups in different countries. But I'm sure 30, 40 years in history books, if they get to write history, it will say that Israel was attacked by all these savage Arab countries, Arab militias that wanted to destroy the state of Israel, and they came victorious. And the rest. Yeah. So this is like history is repeating itself. What happened in 1948 continued. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was related to what happened before 1948, and it's related to everything they did, and they continue to do since.
Thank you, Amo. And that goes into when we call it a systematic Nakba, that the Nakba never ended, it's ongoing, it's systematic, and Israel's deliberately continuing to commit it, because this is what they want. At the end of it, the Palestinian existence itself is a threat, and that is what they don't want. The Zionist goal is the erasure of Palestine, and that's only happening through the Nakba and through the systematic displacement and killing of the Palestinian people. Just a quick note, and when we talked about the refugees and the refugee existence, is that the refugee camps themselves are a form of resistance. So they serve as spaces. Palestinian refugees, the camps are not good spaces, but many Palestinians, as part of their identity and part of their existence and refusal to lose their identity, is they're staying in the camps even though they are not many of them, they're not good. The infrastructure, the space that they have is not good, but part of that is a form of their resistance and their identity, that they are going to hold on to their identity as Palestinians against the ongoing Nakba and the systematic Nakba. Okay, so the next section, hopefully we can get to it with a little less than 30 minutes, is the Nexa. But actually I'll go through a little bit of a build up to it. I'll see how long this video is, so we could watch a quick video that that goes over the build up over the Nexa. So the Nexa is essentially the second big wave of Palestinian loss, and it literally translates to the setback. See how long this video is. It's like it doesn't want to play.
Arab states went to war with the Israelis after this. This is a big moment. 4 p.m., Rothschild Boulevard, David Ben-Gurion officially declaring Israel an independent state. The Jews finally have a home. His talk is pretty nationalistic and very thoughtful. He stresses on points like the state of Israel would strive to develop the land for the good of all its residents, be based upon foundations of liberty, justice, and peace, and that Israel would ensure social and political rights to all citizens without discrimination of religion, race, or sex. But did any of that happen? See, Palestine after World War I was under British control and was seeing a series of violent outbreaks between the Arabs and Jews. And to resolve that, the UN proposed a partition plan which would divide the land into 2 states, Jewish Israel and Arab Palestine, while keeping Jerusalem a UN-controlled international zone. the votes came in. 33 countries approved, 13 countries voted against it, while 10 completely abstained from voting. And although the Arab states walked out as a form of protest, the partition plan was adopted. On the ground, tensions were high, and they continued to escalate with the massacre at Deir Yassin. This started the mass exodus of Palestinians, while Jewish immigration, which was encouraged by the Zionists, was on the rise. The Arabs were becoming increasingly frustrated as the atrocities kept growing, and with the promise of an independent Arab state nowhere in sight, Israel officially declaring its independence triggered a tipping point. Arab forces from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq marched to Palestine. This was the first time the Arab League was formed. And for what? To protect Arab Palestine. To put it into context, the Arab states had just recently declared their own independence from colonial powers. So Arab nationalism was on the rise. And although Arab leaders agreed on the importance of forming a unified Palestinian state, their interests came first. Fawaz Gerges, a professor of international relations, mentioned this about the Egyptian and Jordanian kings, that they appeared to be more concerned about their respective strategic positions than that of Israel. And according to historian Avishlam, the conflict between the Jews and Arabs allowed for the emergence of special relations between the Zionists and Abdullah, who wanted to secure his plans to expand the borders of his country. Nevertheless, the armies of the Arab League launched an attack, and in just a few weeks, Israeli forces were surrounded, facing a possible defeat. That's when the UN intervened with a 4-week ceasefire, which worked in favor of Israel. Ignoring the UN arms embargo, Israel imported heavy armaments from Czechoslovakia and used the time to reorganize. This brings us to a turning point in the history of the war. As soon as the ceasefire was over, Israel launched a counter-offensive, occupying 2 strategic Arab towns which were allocated to Arab Palestine by the UN. 70,000 Palestinians who lived there were forced to flee. The Israelis closed in and continued occupying the areas allocated to the Palestinians. And the Arab armies were not as effective as they were in the first round of fighting. There was little coordination and virtually no cooperation, says Avishlam. The Arab states who were led by Egypt responded by announcing the establishment of a Gaza-based Palestinian government. But this was more of a strategic move by King Farouk to prevent King Abdullah's ambitions to expand his borders. Israel watched the Arab feud, all the while consolidating its own position. It began singling out Egyptian forces with an aerial campaign. Egypt appealed to its Arab allies for help, but its appeals fell on deaf ears. And Avishlam says that the Arab states were either afraid to intervene or did not wish to intervene. By the end of the year, the Egyptians were defeated in Gaza and could no longer support the dream of a unified Palestinian homeland. Desperate, Egypt turned to Britain for help to preserve its territorial integrity. An armistice was signed with Israel, and the other Arab states followed suit and signed separate bilateral agreements with Israel, who now was controlling 78% of the entire territory. This brings us to the end of the war. What did the first Arab-Israeli war bring? An Egyptian military presence in the Gaza Strip, and Jordan was gifted the West Bank as a token for its loyalty to Britain and the Zionists. Meanwhile, 700,000 Palestinians were driven out of their homeland. And the UN's two-state solution? Well, it never saw the light of day. It's been 70 years. The crisis of this catastrophe continues.
Okay, so some of this was exactly what Ahmed Diab mentioned earlier. So the 1967 Nexa, so I think the major points to that they were all most of it was said in the video, but major points were that Arab independence was still new. We had these different states looking out for them for their own interests, but still trying to stand up for Israel. And they were all of them combined were still not as strong as Israel's military at the time, and they were defeated, and this was called the setback. So to review some of the key points, so these there were In 1949, there was something that they said that was a short-lived effort to maintain Palestinian sovereignty called the Government of All Palestine. This fell through. Then there was the fragmentation of Palestine. So the result of this was that the West Bank was annexed by Jordan and Gaza was put under Egyptian administration. And something that wasn't, I think, mentioned in the video was that the Palestinian identity after this was or during this was suppressed. So their currency and their passports were abolished by 1952. And then with the 1967 the war, we had because of the rise of the pan-Arabism and Arab nationalism, you had the leadership were basically try to defeat Israel and they lost, just to put it into a summary that is, and this is basically what was already said in both the video and by Amdiab a little bit.
I have a question.
We're almost done, so if we can just finish and then see if we have time for questions. Thank you. So basically the result of the Nexa was, it was called the setback because this was a big loss, and it resulted in further loss for the Palestinian people. Were like the biggest to lose out because of this essentially. And this actually set the stage for the continued land loss that's happening today and annexation that again is happening once again today. All of this was post 1967. Also something important to note, when we talk about Palestinians, in 1964, prior to this, sorry, I'm jumping a little bit around, because we were from the Arab-Israeli war to the 1967 Nexa. In 1964, there was a creation of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. What was, I guess, most significant about this is that this is when Palestinians decided they wanted to start organizing for themselves, and having their own forms of resistance, and to basically take matters into their own hands. And it was at this time that they focused a lot on the unity of Palestinians and their own self-determination, and this was done through armed resistance. Then we had, and I think I realized I made that mistake, then we had the 1967 Nexa, or the setback or the defeat. So I'm not going to play the video, I think just because of time's sake, but you can definitely watch it. So this was, the next was after 6 days of war between Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, who joined forces to support the Palestinians in their fight against Israel. Israel defeated the countries, and then they officially seized the territories of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, and then also the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula. And this increased their official rule and their power over Palestinian land. What's significant about the Naksa was many things, specifically the impact on not only Palestinian history, but the present reality. And that's what we said with the fact that it set the stage for continued Israeli settlement and annexation of Palestine. So Zionism from this also was officially recognized and legitimized in the world's eyes. So the Nexa essentially allowed Zionism to become the violent project that it is today. It was legitimized in the world's eyes, and we still recognize it for that this was a big wave in displacement, settler colonialism, and exile of the Palestinians. So the video is there if you want to watch it, but we'll skip over it. And I think I didn't realize I said a little bit of this already, but the context, and I think Amdia mentioned this, was Israel claimed that it was surrounded by all of these hostile nations, and it needed to defend itself. And I think, and the world, it was just defending itself, and as a result, we had the major loss of Palestine. And I think, and Amdia add, and just if you need to for anything here, but this was when the US really, it was after this that the US came into play and started to form the allyship that it has today. And this resulted in another wave of 250,000 Palestinian refugees. Primarily, they were displaced at this time to Jordan. And then a few going back to Palestinian resistance and identity, a few key symbols emerged post 1967 from this. So the term samud or steadfastness that Palestinians endure with resilience. This came out post 1967. And then also the idea of martyrdom, so the child of the stone. So you always see that image of a child holding a stone against an Israeli tank. This started post 1967 with the annexation and the rise of youth-led uprisings and Palestinian resistance to occupation, because essentially like so with the Nakba, all of those neighboring Arab states lost and then just left. And the Palestinians were left at that point much on their own. And that's when you had the popular resistance and within the youth and within the people of this time. Like we already said, this continued settlement expansion in the West Bank and then even in the Golan Heights. And it just signaled systematic suppression of Palestinians and also even of the occupied of Syria, which is again another conversation, but they're involved there too. And it also with the Nakba, two things, kind of the legacy that it left was the deepening of Palestinian dispossession and Israel's expansion of territory and land grabbed. And it also strengthened Palestinian resolve to reclaim their identity and their land with this. And that's my last slide for today. Ahmad, do you want to add more about the Nakba? Am I missing anything you want to discuss or mention?
Just for the sake of time, I'd like to open it for questions.
Okay, thank you, Ahmad.
Especially that somebody had a question.
I can read
I
you.
do have a question.
Yes, but just if you could please just try to be cognizant of time so we can get as many people to ask their questions as possible.
So what about the Palestinian Authority today? That's the one that is also known for like another tool for Zionists. Like even though they claim to be Palestinian, but they're like the tool for the Zionists and for the US, the Palestinian Authority.
Let me answer that.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Now the Palestinian Authority, there is division among the Palestinian society, and that division started in 2007 as a result of the division between Hamas and Fatah, which was also a result of the election that happened in 2006. So in 2006 was the first time that there was an election and Hamas was part of the election. They won the majority of the votes, so they won the legislative body of the Palestinian Society, but also President Mahmoud Abbas won the presidency in the same election. Now, in 2007, there was an armed fighting between Fatah and Hamas in Gaza, and that ended up in the division that Hamas ended up ruling Gaza and Fatah ended up ruling the West Bank. Now, for those who doesn't know who Hamas and Fatah is, they are the two main Palestinian political parties. So now the Palestinian Authority is recognized by the world as the arm of the PLO, and the PLO is the Palestine Liberation Organization that does it is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and the PA, which is the Palestinian Authority, is an authority that was created as a result of the Oslo Accord of 1993. It rules the West Bank and Gaza until that division, and as a result of that division, the PA still does rule like all the day-to-day things in Gaza, but Hamas has the military power, and they have the real control. But most of like say doctors, teachers, everybody in Gaza till October 7 was still funded by the PA for the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority is not a tool of Israel as the way you put it, but there is a disagreement in the Palestinian society about the way the PA handles things. There's some people that would go as far as saying what you said, but there's people that will disagree very strongly with that statement. And one of the main things that is problematic in the operation of the Palestinian Authority is the security arrangements that they have with Israel. And those security arrangements were results of the 1993 Oslo Peace Accord. And the 1993 Oslo Peace Accord was an agreement that after 5 years, there would be a Palestinian state. So in order for them to reach that final point of final negotiation for a Palestinian state, both parties needed to show good faith and both parties needed to show peace and no attacks. So part of the agreement was the security that the Palestinians will prevent any attacks on Israel and Israel will prevent any attacks on Palestine on the Palestinians. Now, unfortunately, this peace agreement didn't go. No, Oslo did not go anywhere, and so we said 1993. So it should have ended in 1998 with a Palestinian state, but we are in 2025 and we don't have a Palestinian state. So that's also another big discussion among the Palestinians about the Oslo Accord and the damage it did or it didn't to the Palestinian society. So to answer your question, there is some people in the Palestinian society that share the viewpoint that you said, but the majority of the Palestinians, I would say, disagree with that. They might disagree with the Palestinian Authority's way of doing things. They might disagree with a lot of their policies, but they don't get to the point that you said that they're a collaborator with Israel. Otherwise, they would not be ruling the Palestinian society because the Palestinians will never allow collaborators to rule them, and to represent them. So this is my my answer to that question.
Thank you, Amma.
Manar, do you have a question about this?
It's more about the history. It is towards Ammo, but it's more so about the history of like the Arab-Israeli war, because I think like as an Egyptian, I get bias views from Egyptian elders, but it was always like taught to me that even though it's called the Arab Israel like the Arab Israeli war, that it was actually like Arab versus the West, and that there was a lot of Western intervention to create like a culture of like selling out and fear within Jordan and Egypt. But I always just wondered how like the older generation of Palestinians felt about that, and if they just felt like they truly were simply protecting like their sovereignty as Arab states, or if they were actually being like, I know that I was like repeatedly told that Zionists from other Western nations were in Egypt and trying to like intervene in the Egyptian, even like with King Farouk, to be by his side and like create these like corrupt ideas. But then sometimes I wonder if they're just saying that because they're saving face, because they're too scared to admit or acknowledge that they didn't do their part as like allies or like comrades to Palestine as an Arab nation.
I'm not sure if I understood the question, but I would say this thing, that as Palestinians, we believe that the Palestinian resistance to the Israeli project or to the Zionist project is a way to defend the whole Arab and Muslim world, because we believe that, and the days right now actually showing that this project it does not end at Palestine. It's now in Syria, Lebanon, in Egypt, in Emirates, in Saudi Arabia. So we used to say that the Palestine. I grew up. I'm 57 years old. I grew up with this, listening to that. The Palestinians are the first line of defense of the Arab and Muslim world. And if that line of defense collapses, the Arab and Muslim world are in trouble because of the Zionist movement. Now, that being said, also we grew up learning that the Palestinians backing, like the Palestinians back, and our deep power is the Arabs and the Muslim, and of course all the good people around the world. So I don't know if that answers your question, but this is the way we see the struggle with the Zionists. We see it not just a struggle with the Palestinians. It is a struggle with that the Zionists is not just after Palestine; it's after the whole area. So I don't
Thank
know
you.
if I answered your question or there
Thank
was
you. I'll follow up personally.
inshallah. Inshallah.
Thank you, Amma. For time's sake, we have one more question that I want to ask. It's in the chat by, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but Tisha is asking, what were the roles of political organizations like Fatah during these periods? So the Nakba, Naksa, just because we didn't really get into that discussion.
Sure. Again, if you talk about the Nakba, Nakba is 1948. Before 1948, like Basma said, the Palestinian society was led mostly by families. Like you have the Nashashibi and the Husseinis and all these different groups. The Palestinian resistance movement and organized Palestinian groups started after the Nakba. So before the Nakba, none of these organizations that you hear about right now existed. There was no Fatah, no Popular Front, no Hamas, nothing. Now, they all started, were created after the Nakba. And most of them, except Hamas, were created before the Nakba. So all the Palestinian resistance movement and all the Palestinian political parties that exist today, especially the one that had that practiced armed struggle at one point, they all existed before the Nakba, except Hamas. Fatah was created in 1958, but they officially announced and they became known as a resistance movement in 1965. The Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, I believe, 1968, and then Hamas was created in 1988. So Hamas was created at the end of 1987, actually, with the beginning of the first Palestinian Intifada. What role did they play? So just to give you an example, because of all this history, right now when they're doing the prisoners exchange, the most number of prisoners that they're going to release that have high sentences are from Fatah movement. And that was, I heard that from one of the Hamas representatives that is part of the negotiation. And he said that because the way they did it, they said they will ask for people to be released based on how many of each group are in prison. So based on your percentage in the prison, you will have your same exact percentage released, and Fatah has the highest percentage because they were involved in a struggle from the from a longer time and from the beginnings, and all these movements, I would say their main role was to create the Palestinian to move the Palestinian struggle from refugees displaced by Israel, scattered in refugee camps in all Arab countries, or in few Arab countries, into a political movement that has a nationality that are fighting to create their own state. So moving to creating that Palestinian nationalism and to have the Palestinians speak on behalf of the Palestinians, not other Arabs or other Muslims, because till the creation of the PLO and all these other organizations, the Palestinians had no voice. Every time they will talk to the Arab leaders. Even if you guys remember in the Madrid peace agreement, which was I believe 1991, which was a couple of years before the Oslo Accord, the Palestinian delegation, Israel refused that the Palestinian will send a delegation on the name of the Palestinians. They said if the Palestinians will attend the peace negotiations that was supposed to make peace between the Arabs and the Israelis, including, of course, in Palestine, has to be through the Jordanian delegation. So the Palestinian, the first representative, which was Dr. Hanan Ashrawi and Saab Ariqat and Haidar Abd Shafi, they were part of the they were Palestinians as part of the Jordanian delegations. And it was a huge thing that Saab Ariqat went to the meeting with the kufiya on him. That was like a huge thing that to show that we as Palestinians exist. So what these, again, to that question, what did these people do? They created the Palestinian National Movement, and they made it stay till now that it's fighting, inshallah, for liberation.
Thank you so much, Amma. We all, I'm sure everyone appreciates you joining us and helping us lead this. So we are at time. We're past a couple minutes. So we're going to stop here for today. All of today's class and the PowerPoint will be recorded. I'm sorry, will be uploaded to Google Classroom and be sent out. Next week we're going to be on History Part 2. So post 1967 to the present. If you can join us again, we'd love it. Thank you again. I'll stop sharing there. So thank you for